It didn't happen in one administration. It didn't happen because of one crisis. And it didn't happen because Americans suddenly became reckless. America's debt reached this point the way most national problems reach a breaking point, slowly enough to feel normal, and then suddenly enough to feel inevitable. For decades, the U.S. built a habit: borrow more, grow through it, and assume tomorrow would be richer than today. That worked for a long time because America's economy expanded, global capital trusted U.S. institutions, and the dollar gave the United States a unique advantage that no other country has enjoyed at the same scale. But now we've entered a phase where the old assumptions are starting to fail. And that's why this story matters now. Not as a political argument, not as a scare tactic, but as a real-world explanation of how the system changed, and why the next few years will feel different for households, markets, and policymakers. To understand how America's debt reached this point, you have to stop thinking about debt like a household credit card bill. A country's debt is more like the foundation of its entire economic structure. The U.S. government issues debt to fund everything from defense to healthcare to infrastructure to interest payments on older debt. The buyers of that debt, investors, banks, pension funds, foreign governments, are essentially lending to the U.S. in exchange for safety and interest. For a long time, that arrangement worked smoothly because U.S. Treasury debt was viewed as the cleanest, safest collateral in the world. But the scale has changed, and when scale changes, the rules change. The story begins after World War II, when U.S. debt was high but manageable because the economy grew quickly, and America became the center of the global system. The United States had industrial dominance, a booming population, and unmatched financial credibility. Over time, economic growth helped shrink the debt burden relative to the size of the economy. That's the key idea most people miss. Debt is not just about the number, it's about the ratio. If the economy grows faster than the debt, the burden becomes lighter even if the raw total rises. For decades, this was the quiet miracle of American power. Growth, productivity, and expanding global influence made the debt feel less threatening. But starting in the late 20th century, several forces began pushing the U.S. toward a new debt path. One was the growing expectation that the government would stabilize the economy during downturns. Every recession, every crisis, every shock increased pressure on Washington to act quickly: spend, support, backstop, rescue, stimulate. Another was the rise of entitlement spending as the population aged. As millions of Americans retired, programs like Social Security and Medicare expanded. These weren't temporary expenses. They became structural obligations, promises made by a nation to its people. And as healthcare costs rose, those promises became far more expensive than earlier generations expected. At the same time, America entered a period of repeated major shocks that made borrowing feel normal. The early 2000s brought recession and war spending. Then came the 2008 financial crisis, when the U.S. faced the risk of systemic collapse. That crisis fundamentally changed the relationship between government and markets. The U.S. did what it had to do to prevent financial implosion: massive stabilization programs, bailouts, emergency actions, and then years of low interest rates. Those low rates made borrowing feel almost painless. When interest rates are low, debt looks cheap. Politicians become comfortable running deficits. Markets become comfortable financing them. And the public becomes accustomed to the idea that governments can always borrow more without immediate consequences. Then came the pandemic era, when debt growth accelerated again. Crisis spending was enormous, not because the U.S. wanted higher debt, but because the country had to prevent economic collapse during a historic shutdown. Stimulus checks, unemployment support, business relief, healthcare spending. This was not normal fiscal policy. It was emergency war-style financing. And it worked in the sense that it prevented a depression, but it also left the U.S. with a much larger debt burden and an economy that later faced the consequences of massive demand, returning into constrained supply chains, which contributed to inflation. And inflation is the moment where the debt story becomes urgent. Here is why. When inflation rises, central banks raise interest rates to fight it. When interest rates rise, the cost of servicing debt rises. This is where the U.S. is now facing a different kind of pressure than it faced in the low-rate era. The debt is not only large, it is expensive. Every time old debt rolls over and new debt is issued at higher rates, interest costs climb. And unlike many other budget items, interest is not negotiable. You don't get to pause interest. You pay it, or you face a credibility crisis. This creates a dangerous fiscal squeeze. The government must fund its normal operations, fund entitlements, fund defense, respond to emergencies, and now also fund a growing interest bill. That interest bill acts like a tax on the future. It doesn't build roads, it doesn't improve productivity, it doesn't educate children, it simply pays for the past. And this is why America's debt matters now. Because we have moved from an era where debt was easy to carry to an era where debt competes with everything else. As interest costs rise, political pressure rises. Debates become sharper. Fiscal trade-offs become more painful, and markets become more sensitive to signs of dysfunction. Now, if you're watching this and thinking, but America has always had debt, why worry now? The answer is simple. Because the world is changing at the same time. The U.S. has benefited from being the issuer of the world's reserve currency. That status creates steady demand for U.S. debt. It gives America flexibility. It allows the U.S. to borrow in its own currency and attract global capital during crises. But reserve currency status is not a magic shield. It is a privilege supported by trust. Trust in U.S. institutions. Trust in political stability. Trust in the rule of law. Trust that the U.S. will not destroy the value of its obligations through reckless policy. When the debt burden grows and interest costs rise, markets start paying closer attention to the question of long-term discipline. That doesn't mean they abandon the dollar overnight. It means they begin pricing risk differently. They demand higher yields. They diversify at the margins. They become more sensitive to political brinkmanship. And small shifts in sentiment when applied to a massive debt market can have outsized effects. So what does this mean for regular Americans? It means the debt story is not just a Washington story. It influences real life in several ways. First, higher government borrowing costs can keep overall interest rates higher than they would otherwise be. That affects mortgages, car loans, business loans, and credit card rates. Even if inflation falls, high debt and heavy borrowing needs can keep pressure on yields. That makes housing less affordable. It slows investment. It makes it harder for small businesses to expand. Second, debt limits policy options. In the next recession, the government will face a tougher balancing act. Stimulus may still happen, but markets could react faster to large deficit expansions. The Federal Reserve could still cut rates, but it may be more cautious if inflation risks remain. In other words, the tools that once felt unlimited may feel constrained. When policy flexibility shrinks, downturns can feel sharper. Third, the debt story affects inflation risk. Many people think inflation is over once prices stop rising quickly. But the risk of future inflation comes from structural pressures, supply shocks, geopolitical disruptions, labor shortages, and yes, fiscal dynamics. If the political system struggles to control deficits, and if the temptation grows to rely on easier money to keep the system afloat, inflation can reappear in waves. That uncertainty is exactly what markets hate. Fourth, debt influences national priorities. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar not spent on infrastructure, research, defense modernization, education, or productivity-building investments. Over time, this can weaken the growth engine that made debt manageable in the first place. That's the real danger. Debt can become self-reinforcing. More debt leads to higher interest costs. Higher interest costs crowd out productive spending. Lower productivity growth makes the debt harder to carry. And that cycle becomes difficult to break without painful choices. Now here's the most important part. The part that makes this story matter now, not later. The U.S. is approaching a period where several pressures converge. An aging population, high healthcare costs, global competition, geopolitical instability, and an economy that has to refinance large amounts of debt in a higher rate environment. This convergence creates a narrow corridor scenario. The U.S. must maintain growth, maintain trust, and maintain stability while carrying a debt load that is less forgiving than before. That does not mean collapse is inevitable. America still has enormous strengths. Innovation, deep capital markets, the dollar's central role, and an economy capable of adapting. But it does mean the margin for error is smaller. Decisions that once felt temporary, like running large deficits during good times, start to matter more. Political brinkmanship that once felt like theater starts to have financial consequences. And shocks that once could be absorbed more easily now hit a system that is already stretched. So what should viewers take away from this? America's debt reached this point because the country repeatedly chose stability in the present. Through crisis spending, entitlement promises, and low-rate borrowing, over tighter constraints that would have been politically painful. That is not a moral judgment. It is a description of incentives. Every generation inherits systems built by earlier choices, and now the U.S. has arrived at a moment where those choices collide with higher rates and a more competitive world. And if you want one question to sit with, the question that forces the conversation into the real world, it's this. If America's debt is now expensive to carry, and the next crisis is not a matter of if, but when, will the country respond with disciplined reform that protects trust, or with short-term fixes that slowly erode the advantages that made the debt manageable in the first place? That answer will shape interest rates, inflation, markets, and the daily cost of living for years to come.